Human rights in the post-COVID era. What do we mean by human rights in the 21st century? What are the best introductions to the field for newcomers? What are the most important issues, problems that need to be addressed today? To answer these questions, we interviewed both scholars and activists in human rights. We asked the past presidents of the organized section on human rights in the American Political Science Association what human rights as a concept means to them. We also asked them what books they found the most useful and what major issues needed to be faced in the aftermath of the Trump presidency. We then asked human rights activists and practitioners, lawyers, and members of the NGOs dedicated to improving human rights what human rights meant to them and what they found the most critical human rights to attend to going forward. The definition of human rights.
To me, human rights signifies all of the basic freedoms that should be afforded to every individual. So yeah, it involves everybody, and it really is. It sucks that we have to continue to specify over and over again and say women's rights are human rights, and trans rights are human rights, and gay rights are human rights. It's like I'd love to live in a world where we don't have to be that specific because everyone knows. But if we lived in that world, we probably wouldn't have any human rights issues as well. So yeah.
What I'm always telling my students is the idea of human rights is a very kind of fluid and open concept that's kind of open to a lot of debate. If we were to try to kind of boil it down to one core idea, I think I would say it is really about protecting human dignity. You know, the idea that human beings, by virtue of being human, are entitled to a certain kind of like baseline set of rights. You know, that there are certain things that are not necessarily or certainly not sufficient to ensure that you necessarily have all the things you'd like to have in life, but at least make sure that you're protected from some of the kind of worst deprivations or abuses that other people may, or your society may impose upon you. So I guess if I had to boil it down to one word, I would just say dignity.
In some ways, I'm going to give you the answer I would give when I teach. So my students will say, Dr. Hertel, what does human rights mean? And I will say to them, listen, we can use a very parsimonious, very narrow definition, and then we can debate and problematize and expand it. But the simplest legally grounded often definition is a claim by someone or some group on someone or some group for something essential to human dignity. Then we can part ways and think about what the meaning of human dignity is and how to historicize and problematize and contextualize that. But this claim-making relationship is very crucial. So a claim by someone on someone for something essential to human dignity, or we can place that in a group rights context as well.
What we see is that what people need and what people are struggling for is basic security, physical security, different dimensions of self-determination at the individual, the national, and global and collective level, including across borders, different dimensions of expression and identity, capabilities and resources for living a meaningful, decent, and sustainable life in terms of access to fundamental resources and services. So that's what social rights are usually labeled. And last but not least, relational rights that I think feminist theorists are beginning to work on more. It's related to the concept of capabilities that Martha Nussbaum talks about. So relational rights, rights to honor our relationships with each other, and more generally to practice solidarity, to practice social connection. And one of the things that I have learned through my studies is that we always see every form of repression, dehumanization, and oppression always attacks those collective links, always attacks solidarity first. And that tells us that that is a fundamental characteristic to defend. And we can learn what we need to protect in order to construct a society that is based on human rights, and including a global order that is based on human rights.
Two things are important there. One is there's a relationship between actors who are making mutual claims. And I think for an American student, often we think of rights divorced of responsibilities, but human rights are integrally related to our responsibilities to one another. Rights and responsibilities are mutually derived. In other cultural contexts, there is an almost emphasis on responsibility to one's family or one's cultural group, etc. But for many American students, and I teach in the United States, this idea of my rights and your rights being mutually derived from our responsibilities to each other is really significant. So using that claim-making structure and then insisting that rights and responsibilities are two sides of the same coin are how I define human rights.
Look at what people are fighting for. What are they working on when they reference their human rights?
Right.
And there's quite a lot of variety. Not only because this idea of human rights has broad, international, local and national resonance, but also because people understand their struggles as being well captured by the idea of human rights. If I don't have a safe workplace, I'm not safe to go to work. It's perfectly reasonable that I understand my struggle for worker rights is not the rights of just workers, but rather the right of anybody to live without a disaster-imposed disability, as might happen if you were working without certain protections that worker rights tend to advocate for. I want to advocate for my worker rights. I'm going to need some political rights in order to be able to be a self-advocate. Otherwise, other people are advocating for me. And what I want in my life is to be an agent of change. I want to be an agent of what I want to do for myself, my family, and the world. So it's not really meaningful if other people are assuring my human rights. I'm not really enjoying them if I don't get to enjoy them myself. They're not really a gift from other people. They are what we try to protect with our institutions. But the only way we know if we enjoy our human rights is if we don't need the idea at all. The reason people reference the idea of human rights is because they are currently in a struggle that that means they are not currently enjoying their human rights. So for me, it includes the full list, that the largest list ever includes. Does not include the right to a designer faucet, as I saw in a Kohler ad in the early 2000s. However, it really isn't to any, the way we know whether a particular rights claim, the right to a designer faucet versus the right to clean, safe water, is a human rights claim, is by how I justify it. And if I justify my claim with reference to rights claims that you recognize as your rights, then you and I, as we recognize each other's rights claims, are reaffirming each other's rights and the notion of human rights more generally. So while we might use the idea separately, differently in our cultures, contexts, and struggles, the fact that we use that idea so that we can understand each other is evidence to me that human rights, as I've described them, are in fact a universal political principle.
How did you become interested in human rights?
There was no particular project or any particular activity that kind of sparked my interest in it. When I was doing my graduate work, wanted to feel that I was doing research in an area of international relations that felt kind of meaningful and important to how we think about the world. And for that reason, I decided that, when choosing early in my PhD journey, when choosing a topic to study, that I wanted to try to focus on how we can do things that affect the kind of well-being of people in the world, and focusing on human rights outcomes seems particularly kind of meaningful to me.
So I went from a banking background where credit cards looked like debt. They looked like a burden, and you hoped that people, you manage your portfolio so that people would have money to pay off that debt. And banks make money if there's interest. Okay, switch to the developing context, and women with debt, which is basically credit card debt, unsecured debt, are supposed to be empowered. How is that a particularly good thing for them politically? So I worked with Save the Children for a little bit at that project. And then when I went to graduate school, I quickly realized that if I was going to be a political theorist, my insights needed to be grounded in what people were actually working on. What was the lived experience of these things? So two things happened. I went to Bangladesh and started looking at credit programs, again, still using the language of empowerment and economic development, very much steeped in that field. But this is the early 90s. And we had the Vienna conference at which women's human rights activists had been so successful. Then we had the preparations for the Beijing conference in 1995. And so my entire formative years as a graduate student was colored by this growth in use of human rights. It seemed to me to explain in a much better way what I thought women were trying to do when they, not just when they took on credit card debt, which is what a unsecured microcredit loan is, but really when they were doing, advocating for anything on their own political behalf. So I started my graduate experience with this idea of empowerment, and that was the big idea in the development industry at that time. But by the time I left, human rights was the big idea.
And so my entire childhood was lived with this very international mom and this very local immigrant dad in this very incredibly stressful, complex context known as the civil rights movement. And so I got interested in human rights, I think, by osmosis, because my grandparents were navigating this cultural and development divide that was occurring in the Middle East at the time they were there. Right. And my mom and dad were navigating the reality of the civil rights movement. I began kindergarten 2 years after the civil rights movement really reached a period of profound crisis with the assassination of Martin Luther King. And I began in 1970 as a little kindergartner, when people were bombing inner city neighborhoods and there was tremendous racial tension and there was an abandonment in some ways by the state of responsibility for human well-being. And so I got really interested in economic rights, and I studied development, and I worked as a development person within the United Nations system and in the Ford Foundation and other places. But my human rights work was in some ways informed by this life experience of living across different cultural divides with the reality of education as a tool both for emancipation, but also to challenge systems of oppression. And so my interest in human rights is really first and fundamentally born of a deep respect and solidarity around economic development as a vehicle for one's own well-being, and a challenge of inequality, a challenging to inequality. That is why, again, I was saying to you, I see this deep connection between rights and responsibilities. Right. The inequality we have in the planet is not necessary. It's a choice. And these systems of inequality that perpetuate continued human rights deprivation and or violation is a choice. So we have choice in how we coexist.
So first of all, I'm a child of refugees, and my own family experience has been deeply shaped by human rights, political persecution, asylum, and the dynamics of realization of human rights. As I came of age, before I was an academic, in my youth and through my college years, I participated and continue to participate in social movements and struggles for women's rights, for peace and disarmament. And I was also coming of age in an era, that post-Cold War era of democratization, seeing as I began to travel, but before I traveled to study human rights, still I was already seeing that Latin America, parts of Asia, Eastern Europe were experiencing waves of democratization and greater consciousness of human rights, a reckoning with their past, but also beginning to see the unfinished business that political empowerment still didn't reach, for example, Indigenous peoples and gender violence and other issues. So I saw this in my experience, my practice, before I began to study it. And that's something that has been very valuable, I think, for me.
How would you introduce someone who is not familiar with the field to human rights?
What I would recommend is actually thinking about it yourself by starting with the Universal Declaration, the Child's Rights Convention, and the Disability Rights Convention. I think thinking through what were these people thinking about that made them want to spell this out. I think if you think that through, you'll have a much better understanding of what human rights are in practice at the international level and in practice in struggle. And once you have your handle on that, then I invite you to take a look at a great text like Michael Goodhart has an edited volume text on that introduces human rights. And I like that one in part because I'm included, but also in part because he, in each essay, it's really a standalone essay, and it helps you see how human rights is used as a concept within political science and social sciences across a range of questions.
I would say, as someone who's kind of getting interested in the topic and wants to kind of think about it, certainly accounts of particular human rights abuses, like particularly large human rights abuses, like, the Rwandan genocide, so I'm thinking like Samantha Power wrote a very influential book in 2002, I think it was called A Problem from Hell, talking about genocide and how societies have or countries have failed to respond adequately over the years to that. If people are interested more theoretically, in thinking about human rights, there's a human rights scholar called Jack Donnelly who has written several books on human rights, and one I remember reading early on called Universal Human Rights, just trying to think about what we mean by the idea of human rights. I think that might be a good place to start. But also just looking at, any particular news stories, that capture their interest. I think oftentimes for students who are coming to the topic of human rights for the first time, reading about contemporary issues of things like racial discrimination here in the US, it provides a really obvious entry point. People, interested in any kind of social justice issues, we can think of as human rights issues.
So to my mind, the Disability Rights Convention is the most important teaching tool for understanding the view of human rights that I've been advocating. And that I'm not the only one that understands it. I think that most people who pay attention to the conventions understand human rights in this way. That the Declaration is quite broad, and across contexts, the actual struggles that people are engaged with, and these might be national contexts, but they also might be gender contexts, the CEDAW. They might have to do with age, the Child's Rights Convention. They might have to do with race. And what I'm arguing is, and they might have to do with disability. And what each convention is a set of recommendations coming from those in the communities who are struggling with that kind of injustice about what it means, what it would require for them to actually enjoy that right. So a disability rights person might, everybody's got a right to health, but what does it mean to have a right to health if your experience is coming from one of disability?
Henry Steiner, and Philip Alston's very classic, huge tome called International Human Rights in Context, Law, Politics, and Morals is Oxford University Press, and they've issued a second edition in roughly 2000. But that book, albeit somewhat dated, is a great synthesis of key texts and key debates at a particular from a particular vantage point, which is a very legal vantage point. And Philip Alston served as the United Nations, one of the senior people for the UN in the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that covers the reporting of the convention. Mm-hmm. And he has subsequently served as a special rapporteur around extrajudicial killing and multiple other forms of abuse. And so he has a marvelous ability to look across different types of rights. And I think that the book is trying to engage the breadth of all different types of rights around this legal framework. And so for a very basic legal introduction, I would say the Steiner and Alston sort of Bible is a really useful one. A very different type of book would be Brooke Ackerley's book, Just Responsibility, A Human Rights Theory of Global Justice. And other people may have mentioned that. She's a theorist who is trying to look at this question of one's own individual responsibility for engaging in systems of oppression and changing or altering those. That's very similar to Thomas Pogge's work at Yale. He's a philosopher who's looked at challenging notions of cosmopolitanism, but Brooke's book is a masterpiece in that. Another one that has won many, many prizes in the field and is useful, again, in a technical sense, is Beth Simmons' book, Mobilizing for Human Rights, International Law and Domestic Politics. It would be the complement to the book by Steiner and Alston. It takes law seriously, it takes progress seriously, and it problematizes where the shortfalls are and where the achievements have been without critiquing human rights to the point where we simply throw it out and say it's not good enough. It's taking human rights on their own terms, it's looking at legal progress, and it's Simmons, who's a masterful quantitative researcher, her careful exposition of the evidence to show that human rights can, under certain circumstances, the law and legal institutions really make a difference. And I think it's a very important book. Sometimes people will ask me if I would suggest my own work, any of it that people find of interest. I have an edited volume on economic rights. I think it's great for people to look at, or an edited volume on human rights in the United States. Those are both from Cambridge. I think they're very helpful. I have my own first book and then my own more recent book. The first one is called Unexpected Power, Conflict and Change Among Transnational Activists. And that looks at how unexpectedly actors in the global South have enriched our human rights canon, especially around economic rights, by pushing from the margins to the center some of these economic rights issues. And it looks at child labor in Bangladesh, and it looks at women's labor rights in Mexico. And it really forces an American readership in particular, or a European one, to have to reckon with the power of how human rights activists in other settings aren't just waiting like victims to be assisted. They are agents of change in human rights. And so that 2006 book is one that I commend to people if they're interested in sort of a controlled case study comparison.
In terms of my undergraduate classroom, I begin with usually 3 books together. One is an edited collection by Michael Goodhart, lovely name for a lovely human rights scholar. And that's called Human Rights in Policy and Practice.
Okay.
And it's a collection, so it's a kind of greatest hits that covers different kinds of rights, a little bit of history, a little bit of critical challenge to some human rights concepts, a little bit of development of specific areas, like there's a chapter on children's rights, there's a chapter on social economic rights. In terms of a real reference guide to the full range of mechanisms and some important case studies, there is a book by Jack Donnelly and Daniel Whalen called International Human Rights. That's kind of one-stop shopping foundational work. My own book, Speaking Rights to Power, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2013, was an attempt to summarize and apply what principles and practices make human rights advocacy efforts and campaigns work. And I studied a wide range of my previous movements, such as the movement in Argentina, indigenous peoples, worldwide struggles worldwide, the anti-apartheid movement, some of the classic struggles, and examined what works, what doesn't work, what is the importance of leadership, how do we think about coalitions and alliances. So I think that that is complementary to laying out the tools and mechanisms that Donnelly and Whalen do and the kind of global institutions. And it's complementary to the more situated, issue-specific articles in the Goodhart collection. If you looked at those three together, you would get a really good multi-level, worldwide, multifaceted look at what's going on in human rights, and not just knowledge, but a little bit of analysis of trying to figure out the principles and dynamics.
A flexible approach to human rights.
If you understand human rights as the accessible discourse that people use to describe the struggles that they think are important and in which they are engaged, then you can use it as a concept to talk about any setting where people are advocating and participating in politics. Using the idea of human rights doesn't require that we're working within a democracy. It doesn't require that you're working within a liberal framework. And in fact, if you do think you have to have this, what people will sometimes call the narrow Western view of human rights, you have not understood what is at stake, what people are advocating for.
It helps to kind of adopt a more flexible understanding of what we mean exactly by human rights, because I know when I teach my like introductory course in human rights, a lot of the times, particularly like here in the US, people have a very kind of narrow idea of what they think human rights involves. You know, they're used to thinking about human rights in terms of like freedom of speech and freedom of religion and so on, but they're not so used to using or hearing the term human rights being used in the context of, you know, the right to a basic standard of living, or the right to healthcare provision, or so on, or things like, you know, the right to a clean environment. And, you know, I think what most people will come to realize, you know, with any issue, particularly any social justice issue they're interested in, there will almost certainly be some kind of connection there to what we can call a human rights issue. I'm really working to try to get students to realize what you just told me, because, you know, I think people like to have this very fixed idea of saying, okay, well, once you elevate something to the status of a human right, and it then kind of has that label of human rights, then it tells us exactly what we need to do. You know, if we say that, like in the example you gave, that everyone has a right to shelter, to, you know, to not be living on the street, then that tells us exactly how we should deal with that problem. But then, as your friend said, you can also talk about the right to, you know, make decisions for yourself as being a basic human right, of, you know, not having not having someone tell you where you have to live, or tell you how you have to have a particular problem addressed, or anything like that, in which case then any other kind of intervention is going to feel like a violation of that human right.
Human rights are messy.
The lesson that I want my students to take away is that human rights are messy. You know, they're going to be messy. It's not just like doing some math problem where, you know, you're going to have a clear solution and you say, well, okay, the human rights experts say that this is the solution to this particular problem. There are often going to be situations where people have different claims to rights that come into conflict with each other. In fact, almost all of us live in societies where, or in even just more immediate communities where maybe some of our individual rights are at times in conflict with rights of other people in the society and so on. And, you know, I guess that's, you know, that's what politics is. It's kind of working these things out. But human rights can be helpful in terms of giving us a framework to think about certain things that we think everyone should be guaranteed, or that our society should be striving towards guaranteeing people wherever possible.
I think we can see it in the global movement for women's health. So for some women, reproductive health means access to clean, safe abortion and prenatal care. For other women, reproductive health means freedom from sexual violence and forced abortion. Mm-hmm. So the political context in which somebody makes a rights claim might mean that they claim nearly the opposite thing: the right to an abortion, the right not to an abortion.
Right.
And yet we can understand, and they can understand each other as both making health-based rights claims affecting their life. And the extent that being able to have control over your reproductive capacities affects the way you get to live. By life, I don't mean just life and death, but I mean the quality of life, the health in the life that you have, the ability to have education and whatnot.
What are the main areas in human rights that we should address in the immediate future?
This thought that human rights often is thought of as something that is an issue elsewhere outside of the U.S. It's an international problem. It's something that, quote, the developing world needs to deal with. But I would caution against that and actually just remind people that human rights is for all humans, right? And the U.S. is, you know, a beacon for democracy and human rights and all that, but we're not perfect. We're very far from perfect, as the last summer is demonstrated, and years of advocacy shows. So I would just remind people that human rights starts at home, and if you can care about, you know, despots in other countries and human rights violations in other countries that we don't consider our peers, you can often find those same problems here in the U.S. Environmental issues, I'd say, is a good example where you see a lot of that happening, where you're seeing the human rights of communities being violated. Even when on paper they say they're going to do certain things, they just turn around and decide not to do them. I mean, everyone has a right to a healthy, livable environment, and that's not true. And people don't actually enjoy that human right here in the U.S. So, not to say the international world isn't important. It definitely is, and what's happening abroad is important. But we need to remember that a lot of what happens outside also happens here. And to that point, sometimes, you know, the U.S. being an imperial country, we have territories around the world, and we are involved in so many other the politics of other countries. Sometimes we test things out domestically and then see how it works abroad, and sometimes it's the reverse, where we try things out in other countries and then bring that same practices here in the U.S. So I would highly remind people just the fact that human rights is just as important to deal with in the U.S. as it is abroad, because they do have a ripple effect, that what we do here affects people internationally and vice versa.
as a worldwide agenda, I think that we need to think very hard about backlash, regression in human rights, the rise of authoritarian or declining democratic, often populist regimes, and the attacks of those rising structures on solidarity. We've seen both specific crackdowns on people's protest and assembly rights worldwide. We've seen a renewal of competitive and violent ethno-nationalism and hate crimes worldwide. We've seen regimes using those logics and also a very specific gendered backlash, regression in women's rights, regression on violence against women, including, for example, Turkey just dropped out of an international convention on violence that they had hosted years ago. Russia has diminished its own domestic violence law. I mean, we're seeing very serious backlash and shortfalls. And alongside that, we've seen a manipulation of homophobia and rape culture by aspiring authoritarian leaders like Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, Donald Trump, formerly in the United States. We've certainly seen a surge in domestic violence worldwide, but particularly in the US during the era of COVID. And that is an area that requires urgent attention. We've also seen real slippage in workers' rights and in accountability and responsibility of employers and corporations. This has long been an issue across borders. It continues to be, but I think even within localities, given the lockdowns and the economic crisis that we've experienced.
I'm not going to answer that in a substantive way. What I'm going to say is we are going to have the same struggles that we have now. They're going to vary by site. They're going to vary by political environment. We're going to have the same struggles because we still have the structural injustices and the constraints on transforming our national, international, and even local institutions, values, practices, and norms, such that there are people everywhere who are struggling for their human rights. And structural injustice, what in one of my books I call Injustice Itself, following John Stuart Mill, that is a core obstacle to enjoying human rights for so many.
It's hard to say what we should concentrate on because there's so much. I really think, though, at the end of the day, most, if not all, of the human rights issues that we're seeing are intertwined. And so I think it's more about, in the movements that are prevalent, really making sure that we're making space for the voices of those who have not been uplifted even within those movements. And that's something that I say very often. So in regards to like Black Lives Matter, I mean, trans women of color have experienced, an influx of fatal hate crimes for the past couple of years. And it's really important that we involve them in this movement and shift the lens so that we're not just focusing on like a cisgender victim, but also on transgender victims. So like that's something that I think is incredibly important. And yeah, it just goes to with every movement, making sure that we're constantly questioning, okay, who's not being involved in the conversation? How do we bring them into the conversation?
The legacy of racial discrimination in the US.
The number one thing here in the US just now, and it's certainly not unique to the US, is dealing with our legacy of racial discrimination and in all its kind of more subtle forms. I think obviously it's not something that can be fixed overnight. I think it's kind of important for people to realize that, that problems, that kind of racism as a kind of set of ideas didn't end with the civil rights movement of the 1960s. It's an ongoing problem. We see it in so many ways. I think, trying to see race relations in the US through more of a kind of human rights lens, is particularly important, and to think about the ways in which more subtle forms of racial discrimination affect the way in which we think about so much of the way that our society is organized.
And there are legacies of historic discrimination against people of color in the United States around access to health and ill treatment and or lack of consultation. But we need to redouble our efforts to build confidence and to create access, because we have a shared responsibility for public health.
Certainly, marginalized communities have been trying to draw our attention to this problem. And not all people in all marginalized communities agree that human rights is the best way to address these problems. Indigenous activists are divided on whether human rights is a useful framework for what they're trying to argue for. And I would not speak for them. I think their arguments about resurgence and framing their politics that they are wanting to put forward in the world and live into and enjoy, that politics is not best understood as only resistance to the form of politics we have today. It is better understood as a reconception, as a new conception born starting from a different ontology, starting from another place from the founding myths of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism that dominate a lot of how we understand the global political economy. It's not the only ontology out there, and indigenous politics are not the only sites of counter-hegemonic ontologies, but they invite us to think more ambitiously about just how much needs to be reconsidered if we really want people to be able to, and now I will use the language of human rights, to really enjoy their human rights. They may choose to use a different language to describe that, but I think at that point, once we've recognized that it has to come from a revisioning of our worldviews, then I think we will be talking about common ground, regardless of the discourse we use to get to that common ground.
So, being realistic, I know a president, even though they are with a lot of power, a president is limited in what they can do. There's a whole bureaucracy behind a president that, keeps going whether the president's there in 4 years or not. So, the Biden-Harris administration made a lot of promises and inspired a lot of people to vote. But at the end of the day, president can control the executive branch. And so, Biden, I think, is doing what he can to do that when it comes to human rights here in the U.S. as well as abroad. And he can encourage, Congress to act in a certain way as well. And so it looks like Congress is making some progress. Speaking of human rights, policing and police violence is definitely a human rights issue. So there's the bill that's going through Congress right now, which is the Just Policing Act. And so that would go a long way from where we currently are in making sure people are not being subjected, having their human and civil rights violated by police forces in the U.S. So I think, Biden having the pulpit and the power he has to encourage the other branches of government to go along with that, I think is one thing that he can and seems will be doing.
The citizenship gap.
In general, there has been substantial progress on inclusion of different groups and populations, and at least recognition, even if you can't get it in practice, at least in theory, we now count people of different identities and statuses. But the one area where we are lagging in the who is human component is what I've called the citizenship gap. And that is people who are not citizens or second-class citizens or living across borders are lagging behind, even as within borders, we at least have the theory of increasing recognition and the capacity for empowerment and self-determination. So what this means is that the Biden administration, and actually every country in the world, needs to pay more attention to migrants, internally displaced people, people who have never had their citizenship fully recognized. So in many countries, indigenous peoples or ethnic minorities or border spanning nationalities. And I can point you around the world at all of these populations.
Children's rights.
So I think the United States has to join as many of the institutions we left quickly so that we have the talent and the tools and the mechanisms and the shared stake. But then at the domestic level, we have to create an enabling environment for rights protection and fulfillment by reframing issues as shared values and shared rights and responsibilities. And I would begin with children's rights. None of the people who are saying send those kids back would want their own child to be placed in a situation where they're likely to be killed. So I think that just as much as we have to re-engage on the global stage with the institutions, whether it's NATO or the Organization of American States or the Children's Rights Convention or the Kyoto Protocol and related climate change framework.
Socioeconomic rights.
Now, in terms of what is right, we've made great progress on, again, the institutional recognition and the capacity to struggle for it, not necessarily the fulfillment, but the capacity at least to mobilize for civil political rights and fundamental physical security. Where we generally lag around the world is in social rights, social and economic rights. And those are highly interdependent with civil and political rights. And where we lag, particularly in this country, is health rights. And we have had a bitter and horrendous lesson this past year in the cost of having an advanced, developed democratic society that lacks health rights. And we have seen that health care is a human right. We have seen how unequal and discriminatory health rights have been in this country. And we have seen the consequences and the spillover effects for the right to life and all kinds of other rights and conditions.
Economic injustices, particularly here in the US, that that are giving rise to just terrible kind of abuses of what we'd call economic rights. The fact that so many children here in the US are growing up in poverty, even though this is such an incredibly wealthy country. And of course, these kinds of issues are closely tied to the history of kind of racial discrimination and the way in which the way in which government assistance in the US is thought about in very kind of racialized terms, and has been for a long time.
Climate change.
Climate change is a very time-sensitive issue, and that is something that is going to affect humans, particularly humans in developing countries. It's going to affect people of color on a greater scale and more immediately. And so I think it's important for people to understand that connection.
But I would say environment. I would say climate actually, because, and not just because it's my area, but at the end of the day, if we don't have a livable planet, I know Elon Musk is trying to colonize Mars, but that hasn't happened yet. So if we don't have Earth, we don't have any other, like, we won't have anywhere to live. And so any other subject area or rights will really be a moot point if our Earth is no longer a habitable place. So I would say focusing and taking climate change and the climate crisis seriously, I think would be a priority, because all of these other issues flow from that. And as humans, I believe we have a human right to a planet that we can live on. And I would say Earth, since that's where we all are from, I would say we have a human right and a human duty to protect this Earth and the climate and the ecosystems that support us.
Another interesting area of human rights that we're all going to have to kind of face, whether we like it or not, is the relationship between human rights and the environment, and more specifically the kind of intersection between climate change and human rights, because we're all going to be suffering the same, or not the same consequences of climate change, but we're all going to be suffering from climate change in certain ways, but certain groups are going to be suffering much more than others. And I think applying a kind of human rights lens again to try to understand some of the consequences of climate change can be pretty useful. And I think it's something that we all need to start, or our political leaders need to kind of start addressing or with the kind of urgency that it deserves.
Now, if I had said that before the pandemic, the illustration I would have offered would be climate change. And the reason I would have offered that example is because that is something that maybe not everybody is aware is going to affect them, but it is. If you look at any map, you will see that part of your world, and certainly part of the world, the parts of the world where the things you consume, the things you sell, the things you enjoy come from or go through, all through those avenues, your world will be affected by climate change. Insurance companies are anticipating this, and we should too.
I think that the United States has to engage in the global climate framework. And this is a wonderful opportunity for us to think about all of the issues I work on: supply chain management, labor rights, sustainable business conduct. Businesses themselves, when the previous administration sought to distance itself from these protocols, business itself had already invested heavy sunk cost in creating more environmentally sustainable manufacturing processes. And businesses themselves said, I'm not going to suddenly take the scrubbers off my stacks of my factory and pollute freely just because you tell me I can. I can't then export to Europe because they won't accept things made under those conditions. And I've invested this cost in developing a whole cadre of people in my supply chain in the US, in Egypt, in Belarus, who are my suppliers, who I've told, I'm coming to check on you. I'm coming to check on you, be socially and environmentally responsible. So I think actually this is where my work around the Tethered Fates book, Companies, Communities, and Rights at Stake, I see inextricably our overconsumption problems globally and our environmental peril, and the responsibility of business as an actor that is part of the solution, not the problem, if we can harness through a regulatory framework, a rights-informed one, as a great challenge for us moving forward.
The right to health.
If we think of right to health as a basic human right, one of the big questions we're going to be facing over the next few months and probably next few years is how to ensure a kind of equitable distribution or equitable access to the COVID vaccines. Because very soon we're going to be in a situation where if you're lucky enough to live in a rich country, you will be vaccinated against COVID, and otherwise chances are you're not, or you're going to have to wait another couple of years. So that's certainly a very kind of immediate question, but one that presumably in a couple of years will be, maybe not fixed altogether, but we'll have made a lot of progress.
Since the pandemic, I think it's easier to illustrate because it was so immediate and so many people experienced it and so many people witnessed it. I think since the pandemic, it's easier to illustrate why and how we need to understand human rights injustices as structural injustices. This is not about we have a perfect world and one individual is not enjoying their human rights. This is about we have an imperfect world and whole categories of people are not enjoying their human rights. And why? Because the structures of the political economy, social economy, and I would add to that, because it doesn't reduce to those others, our epistemic economy, the way in which we know and the way in which we tell the difference between fact and opinion mean that some people's knowledge is disrespected. Some people's experience is invisible.
The right to security.
Or the kind of very big picture issues, I suppose, is the right to security, basically. So many, when we think of things at the international level, so many people are not, are not living in a world or in a society where they're able to kind of basically be safe, be physically safe, whether that's because they're living in a war-torn region, or whether they don't enjoy the same kind of citizenship rights that other people around them enjoy, whether they're subject to discriminatory laws on the basis of gender or sexual orientation or religious or political affiliation and so on. So these are kind of ongoing issues that have been kind of at the forefront, or particularly the issues like racial discrimination have been at the forefront of the human rights movement for most of the kind of post-World War II period, but certainly haven't been solved, and there's tons and tons of work that still needs to be done on them.
Gender inequity.
What I have seen more recently is that there is an interdependence between the structures and dynamics of gender oppression and gender equity with every form of human rights, including, for example, health rights. I have been working with, in terms of resources, I've been working with a group of women scholars in a group called womanstats.org. You can go on their website, collecting data, collecting information, pieces of information and data and numbers about the status and conditions of women worldwide. We have, I believe we're up to 147 countries or something like that.
Oh, amazing.
And yeah, and we have everything from land rights to health rights to different forms of violence and family law, all kinds of things. And the dozen or so co-PIs on that project, for example, the lead is Valerie Hudson, who is an amazing scholar, who has documented. So there's my own work, but then these other women are documenting worldwide the interconnections between gender and peace, gender and health, women's rights and political freedoms. And so there's a great book called The First Political Order that shows systematically how oppressions of women in certain societies are part of what keep those societies oppressed in other ways, hold them back from development and so forth, because we really have moved from the public sphere rights, public sphere political rights and security, to understanding the economic underpinnings and the social base of peace, freedom, and development, to now looking in the most private sphere, in households, in families, in cultural definitions of masculinity and femininity that have consequences for people's freedom, for people's peace and well-being. And one of the frontiers in this is the idea of reproductive rights, women's basic self-determination over reproductive functions, which has also regressed in a number of countries worldwide. And of course, we know that that's linked to women's personal well-being. It's also linked to a society's well-being. And I have several of my publications that speak to this. One little thing, it's not a book, but it's just a blog on a site called the New Security Beat, which I recommend for interesting takes on environment development and human rights struggles. It's called Why Feminism is Good for Your Health. And with one of my graduate students, Miguel Fuentes Carreño, who's in Mexico, and looking there at some of these issues, we just lay out some of the connections between some of the interdependence between gender equity and health rights across the world.
How to consume.
And I think that one of my most incredibly challenging jobs as a professor is not to just enlighten students into a black hole by showing them how bad the world is. We do need to understand and appreciate its inequalities and its structural injustices, but we also need to empower people to feel they can make a difference.
Exactly.
And so the Tethered Fates book really pushes people to think about poor people who live in communities impacted by manufacturing, not just as sort of collateral damage. If the factory goes, great. If it comes, great. But as integral to the fabric of, as we were saying, this shared set of responsibilities that we have as consumers, for thinking through how those people themselves impacted by the community might be a resource of information, of innovation, of energy, and should be part of our field of vision as we think about where we're purchasing. Not to just stop buying anything that's not made in America, but how to buy responsibly and how to consume responsibly, and potentially, in many ways, my colleagues who work on economic justice, how to consume less, how to think about restructuring what we need and want. So that's my more recent work.
Learning about human rights.
Certainly from my own experience, I think for some students, there can be a certain kind of mystique around the idea of human rights, feeling that, you know, they should only take a course in human rights if they're already a specialist in some particular human rights issue, or, you know, there's the sense that they need to have already kind of done a lot of work, you know, on some particular cause. And I think, you know, what I would say to most students who are just kind of curious about the idea is just, you know, just take a course in it. There's very little you need to have by way of background to start kind of learning about how what we call the human rights regime works, you know, what makes up all the kind of different international organizations that deal with human rights. In my case, my undergraduate degree was actually in biochemistry. So I went into a master's course or a master's program in international relations just because I was kind of interested in the topic. And I remember taking my first course in human rights with no, you know, kind of wondering at first, like if this course was going to make sense for me because of these kinds of kind of preconceived ideas I had about what a human rights course was. And I found it so fascinating. You know, I found it fascinating not just because, you know, the actual subject matter is so kind of important, obviously, but it's also really interesting, you know, thinking about human rights just as a kind of way to understand how international politics works.
Let's see. There's so much. There's some great documentaries like on Netflix. What Happened to Simone, Disclosure. What was the name of the James Baldwin documentary? I'm Not Your Negro. The list goes on and on. Honestly, I just go through there and you just look at, you know, the specific category. There's so much that you can find. As for books, again, there's so many. Autobiography of the Life of Frederick Douglass, for me, is like, I think, one of the books that I hold most dear to my heart. So I would recommend, honestly, like, I do think that social media is a good place to start your journey towards like enlightenment, because I have found that like following accounts that'll kind of just give you a bunch of information about different parts of history, about what people are doing now, about current struggles, really allows you to like kind of explore the full spectrum of social issues, and then to go and do your own research, whether that's like going through a Wikipedia page, or, you know, going on YouTube or going on Netflix or whatever, and educating yourself further. So that's honestly been really helpful to me. And I feel like I am following a similar pattern to how I was in college, just trying to take as many classes as I could. And, you know, whether it was like LGBTQ plus history, or French and Francophone history, or, you know, learning about the Holocaust, Rwanda genocide, and just kind of trying to gather knowledge from as many places as possible, and then again, like feeling further motivated to dig more into those topics. So yeah, I would just say try to learn about any and everything, and there's no one book that's gonna like teach it all.
The best films that I think I would highlight in some ways connect to that early 2006 book. They're two beautiful films. One is called Stolen Childhoods, and it's a film by Robin Romano that looks at the worst forms of child labor, which are distinct from acceptable forms of child work. My own daughter is a lifeguard. You may have worked as a girl babysitting, or taking care of other people's kids, or helping in a store with your family, but we have 4 unacceptable forms of child labor that were defined after great participation by developing country activists. And those 4 forms, hazardous work, illicit work, child trafficking, child prostitution, those forms, nobody, no matter what the level of development, wants their child to do, because the child will be extinguished through those 4 forms. And so Raman Romano's film forces us to look at those 4 forms. And then I would juxtapose it with the beautiful film called A Kind of Childhood by Tariq and Catherine Masood, Bangladeshi film that looks at what happens to children when they are moved out of less harmful forms of work, and how to be more responsible for the larger rights of the child as consumers and as contributors through our tax base to development efforts globally, and as looking at fair trade rules and engagement in the global economy. That film forces us to have to think about the complex choice that working children navigate every day. And it follows a boy who left a factory after a big US boycott, and where he went. He went into a special school that the ILO set up for children. And he was so excited, and he was learning to read, and the stipend that was provided as a part of the accord that took these children out of the factory helped him, but only up to a point. His father was disabled. His mother left the household, and then he was pressed back into work.
Oh, wow.
So how it makes us think about child labor as an embedded phenomenon, not just cute kids on the back of a cereal box who you send 25 cents off to help, but systems that are so complex that we as global citizens have to take a role in making the world more just. So those 2 films are really beautiful. And then I highlighted for you in my response to this question in the email I just sent, 2 wonderful links, which I often commend to students. One is the US Human Rights Network. It's part of this larger network across the United States and in multiple countries of grassroots groups who are seeking to participate in dialogues around policymaking from a human rights perspective. It's very connected to the Human Rights Cities movement, which you probably are aware of globally. And then the second is a classic example of an NGO in the US that has worked on economic rights and on foregrounding those economic rights. And it's called Partners in Dignity and Rights. And it was formerly called the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative. But Partners in Dignity and Rights has really helped Americans think differently about a range of issues: access to health, push out of poor children from schools when they're disciplined and suspended, the prison to school to prison pipeline for those suspended kids, a whole range of issues around economic justice. And so I love to commend to students networks that are forcing us to think differently about where social power can be nurtured and developed for promoting an inclusive vision of human rights, not just the top-down Alston and Steiner volume. That's very important for understanding the superstructure, but also these networks that help us understand participatory changes in human rights and the galvanizing impact that it can have to be part of a bigger network. So I included those. And then finally, a final resource that's free and available and open to everyone would be the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights website. All of the treaty law is there. All of the maps that show which countries have ratified what are there. All of the rapporteurs reports are there. And I can tell you, having grown up in Michigan, that when the special rapporteur on water or the special rapporteur on housing came to places like Flint or Detroit, where our people didn't have access to water, Black communities in those places, drinkable water, that visit by the commissioner, that by the special rapporteur, and the harnessing of that visit by local groups changed the discourse around rights and entitlement in my own country. And so I urge students to look at the Office of the High Commissioner's website as a portal to resources, to use that information as broadly and possibly and widely as they can.
I have mixed feelings when it comes to social media, that's for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that it can be a positive if you are using it with the right intention. But I do think it is, I'm not a fan of, the way that we have this kind of tunnel vision when it comes to human rights issues on social media. And it's like, okay, hashtag, da-da-da, okay, everyone's focused on that.
Yeah. Okay,
now we're over here. Okay, now we're over there. And it's like these things are all still going on all the time. So I think that for us, it kind of becomes like this trend kind of thing. Like we almost treat human rights issues the way that we would treat a TikTok trend or Instagram trend, and or a music trend or whatever. Everyone's hopping on it and they hop off just as fast. And I think that I'm always appreciative when I see a post where it's like, hey, remember, this is still happening. This thing from like a couple months ago, like this issue still persists. So I think it's important to continue to study those issues and not let it just be a wave or phase or, yeah.
Human rights as cheap talk.
There's a lot of time when human rights scholars talk about what we call cheap talk, how many leaders of countries like to talk about human rights because it sounds good to say you care about human rights. Nobody wants to go on record saying they're against the abstract principle of human rights. But, people make human rights arguments sometimes to justify certain policies that are not exactly, helping to promote human rights. Think of, like, for example, the Trump administration's claims that, like, its Remain in Mexico asylum process was meant to be about kind of protecting the welfare of some of these young asylum seekers. So, it's kind of fascinating seeing how the language of human rights is being used and abused by different political leaders in different ways.
What makes a human rights activist?
I mean, so I'm someone who studies human rights. I don't really consider myself an activist in the way that people who do, what I consider sort of the much harder work of actually campaigning around particular issues rather than kind of thinking about them. But, I would say, anyone who's kind of getting involved with a particular issue in some way and is starting to develop experience with advocating for a particular cause, just kind of very grassroots experience, counts and will be helpful. In terms of people who do this professionally, I mean, it is certainly the case that a lot of people who work for human rights organizations do have law degrees, and that for many people is a kind of like entree into the world of kind of like professional human rights activism. But there are there are thousands of people who I think, are one has to think of them as human rights activists, even though they're not, they're not kind of credentialed necessarily in any way. They're just people putting in the effort to advocate for a particular cause or issue. Right. I know that, there's certain like very high profile human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International that most students, would be absolutely thrilled to have an opportunity to intern or to do some kind of work there. And positions like that are, tend to be very competitive. But I think, even someone working on some kind of local human rights issue, maybe some like local county level agency dealing with, human rights violations in that area, is still work that will be very useful to them, and to their future careers.
Right. Biggest challenges to human rights.
And so that, if you'd asked me, what is the biggest challenge facing the human rights enterprise, either as an intellectual enterprise or a political project or a social framework, it would be the assault on its integrity and its promise from within by people who are frustrated with the elite or legal or Western or etc. And then this clever co-optation of the language of rights, my right not to wear the mask, my right not to be vaccinated at the expense of others. And Americans are uniquely, unfortunately, good at saying their rights, but without their responsibilities. So some of what I think is bothering me or worrying me very much is finding a way to forge a conversation space that is open about the limitations, but does not throw all of human rights away as a project. Because I feel if we did, then we lose a standard for moral progress. Regardless of our religious identity, regardless of our social status, every single one of us is a bearer of rights and duties. I think we have to really redouble our efforts to cultivate an enabling environment with a language of shared and mutual rights and responsibilities and shared human dignity. And I fear for the United States, if we do not do that, that we are entering an abyss that we see in many transitional countries when they're transitioning away from a stable democratic system towards an incredible period of acrimony that can lead to real mutual demonization. And I worry very much that if the United States does not arrest this spiral, that we move into a period of protracted instability and widening inequality that is incredibly bad. I have a teenager. I don't want my daughter to live in a world that would be that unstable and that unequal. Part of the problem for us in Egypt or in the United States or in Guatemala is that people themselves have seen each other in a zero-sum setting, where if you gain, I lose. I don't want us to move in that direction. We have to look collectively at how we develop systems of production and consumption that are inherently more socially and environmentally sustainable. Exactly. No one wins if we all die in the end with a broken ozone layer and no layer left to breathe.
Feminism and human rights.
So in terms of feminism, there has been a lot of discussion about the positive nature of women's leadership. We know, for example, that the COVID champion countries are headed by women. But in that piece, in that blog I'm telling you about, the why feminism is good for your health, we go beyond that and say, besides just the countries headed by women, countries that have better gender equity do better on COVID. For example, Canada is headed by a man. Canada under Trudeau and the US under Trump. Canada does a lot better on COVID, and they're similarly situated societies, right? So Trudeau's not a woman, but Canada is a much more gender equitable society. And if you look at their legislation and women's, the pay gap and all kinds of metrics, childcare, all kinds of things. So there's women's empowerment, leadership, but also broader empowerment as a positive response to the fulfillment of all kinds of rights. And there's also a sense in which a feminist consciousness supports human rights consciousness. And we are seeing a rethinking of social relations, of global relations. There is this rising idea of feminist foreign policy, that countries can reorient toward more collaborative, more positive international interactions that carry concrete rewards and get out of the box of the competitive, particularly ethno-nationalism and militarism that has diminished their own well-being as well as global peace and security.
Possible solutions.
So I think the first step, and he's begun that right now, is to rejoin as many of the international institutions that the previous administration left as possible, to rejoin the UN Human Rights Council, to re-engage with the climate accords, Kyoto, to ratify treaties that we've left off the table for generations, like the Economic and Social Rights Covenant and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's shameful that the US is the only nation not to ratify the CRC. And I wish he could use the ratification process not as a Democratic versus a Republican, but as a visioning tool for how we imagine we want children in the United States to live in the 21st century. So to use the strength of those global institutions, the Council, the Human Rights Council, these treaty framework, and especially the treaties that relate to global environmental crisis, because we're at a moment of real inflection where we cannot continue as we are with the consumption patterns that we have sustained and the current framework for regulating and or incentivizing economic activity. And so I think we cannot do this as an island unto ourselves. The United States is a powerful nation, but it is not the only nation on the planet. And it cannot lead by example in a moment where it has left institutions left, right, and center. I think it's besieged with crises, such as the surge in migrant youth coming to the border, but these are old and cyclical crises. This is not the first time we've had lots of people. It just happens to be young people. So there I would see a really important role for the International Organization of Migration and a very, very important role for re-empowered NGOs and for transparency around the treatment and management of those children. But I would see an equal challenge, which is, remember, we have to respect, protect, and fulfill rights. And respect is the state and its agents don't violate. Protect is that we protect you from violation by non-state actors. And fulfill is to create an enabling environment through law, policy, social change, programs aimed at creating that enabling environment. I think the United States desperately needs to create an enabling environment of tolerance, mutual respect for the fulfillment of human rights writ large. And we have to change the discourse from us versus them and policy A versus policy B to our shared humanity, to our rights and responsibilities to one another. The masking debate in the United States, I feel, completely misses the point. I mask so that you can enjoy your right to health. I curtail my personal freedom to mask or not so that you can enjoy your right to health. It's inconvenient. Yes, I forget my mask. I remember and I go back to the car. But your right to health, Naha, is so important that I can't diminish your right to health by my freedom not to mask. I take a vaccine because we have a shared interest in public health.
So that whole phenomenon of backlash and attacks, not just shortfalls in human rights, but attacks on the concept, manipulation of the concept, pitting people against each other in a competitive way. And I think that the response that we need, I have talked about coalitions and alliances a lot in my previous work, but I think we need to even go deeper. And in terms of ethics and concepts, I think we need to renew our arguments, our advocacy for interdependence, for the consequences for everyone of ignoring or diminishing human rights of any part of the population. We kind of assumed that those were obvious and or that people would respond to ethical and moral imperatives for the necessity of protecting rights as we raise consciousness worldwide. But we've seen that that's fragile. And so we really need a new wave of human rights education, of ethical consciousness raising, and of specific documentation. For example, in the United States, we have had some great projects documenting the economic contributions of immigrants. I think we need more and more of those reminders, because when people are in crisis, unfortunately, they forget important solidarity principles that hold our society together.
I think that storytelling is so important to activism and change, and I think that's been my primary weapon for change, is my ability to just share my story and do it as authentically as I can. And so, yeah, I think it's just so important to be able to do that, whether you're sharing it just in a poem, in a film, or giving a speech, or just being as loud as you possibly can, or even if it's like in a work setting or a school environment, and there's something that makes you uncomfortable, or someone says something that isn't okay, just speaking up right then and there. And I think authenticity and truthfulness is something that unfortunately isn't always rewarded in our society. And we see that obviously with Me Too, and with Bill Cosby. I mean, he's now been released after so many people have come forward and have sacrificed like their careers, their relationships, and their privacy to be able to share their truth. And I think that, yeah, it's just important to not let those people suffer in vain, and to join them and be able to then share our stories as well, and stand up for those who can.
Next generation of scholars.
I tend to also point people towards my graduate students' work that they've recently published. So I think the next generation of scholars are remarkable for their ability to trenchantly look at human rights problems, often informed through their own life experience. So one of my Bahamian graduate students has written a brilliant book for University of Pennsylvania Press called Statelessness in the Caribbean, and it explores the phenomenon of rooted displacement, of how people over generations without proper citizenship as stateless peoples get stuck in a legal limbo that's often quite constructed by the state as a way of othering racialized or other groups. And so her book, or my brilliant student Takia Harper Shipman's book, that looks at aid ownership and the fallacy of the idea that developing countries own the aid. How much of the aid do they really own? How much of the management, when we talk about ownership, do they really have the capacity to enact, or the ability to enact by legal structures? And so Takia's work is informed by her scholarship. She's a scholar of Africana studies. She's African American. She's lived and worked in Africa with the United States Peace Corps, but also as an independent scholar. So Takia's book on aid ownership from Routledge is a really critical read of what we mean when we say development. And just as Christy as a Bahamian is writing, Takia is. And then I have a brilliant student who's working on a book. He's Afghani, Wai Swardak, Ahmed Wai Swardak. Mm-hmm. And his book looks at what he calls hybrid justice in a society where there's Muslim law and tribal law and Western law in a post-conflict period. How do we find the justice that works across these different valences? And I have a brilliant student, Tim Zarilla, who's working on an incredible study tracing fair trade coffee as it developed in multiple different settings. And that book is going to be coming out probably within the next year or so, I'm hoping, from Lynn Reiner Press. So I often will direct people to these website with my CV to these students who are doing the next generation of scholarly work, informed in many cases Afghani, African American, Bahamian, and then the student who's worked in the coffee industry as a development extension and marketing consultant, informed by their life experience. And I think some of that has then percolated into the way they teach. My student, Corinne Tagliarina, uses the Flint case study she wrote on the right to water directly in the way she teaches today. And so they use their dissertation work to inform and reimagine what we mean by rights. So I often will say to people, I can give you all sorts of books that I would recommend from my generation, but be looking ahead to the next generation of human rights scholars, to what you know how will write or what others will write in that next generation, because you're seeing problems and imagining solutions in a way we in my generation can only begin to imagine. So I will send you a separate link to that list of young, brilliant scholars. And I'll send you a click also to those who've been involved with our economic and social rights program at UConn, recent PhDs, because I think it would be really exciting for you to foreground also these next generation of voices.